Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, SPC-205, whatever time you're consuming this little artifact of educational media. It is I, again, your instructor, Vic McInnes, coming to you live on tape from my COVID-19 compound in Grovetown, Georgia, the Acotech Outpost in Columbia County. Today's little message is brought to you by Vegetables. Vegetables want you to know that Cool Ranch Doritos aren't a vegetable. Okay. All right, so today we're going to be doing our final review, and here's how my final reviews go. This will be done in class. Of late, I've been doing them online via videotape, so nobody can complain that they didn't get the same review everybody else did. Also, my reviews are not intended to give you a chance to go back and ask me questions because you weren't present for a lecture, or you didn't pay attention, or whatever. These are the issues that as you study for your final, which will be sometime next week. I'm still trying to nail down dates and how they want us to do that. As you study for your final, these will be the areas that I will be using to derive questions over the next 48 hours. I haven't written the final yet. I never write the final until classes are done. Classes are pretty much done at this point. So what I have here is I have my file with my lecture notes. Okay, and what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go over just some things that I think are important that you're going to want to be aware of, again, important key concepts that in order for me to assess your how you gain the knowledge and what knowledge you take away from this, these are going to be the questions I ask. I'll be honest with you, I tried to get them in order as we went through the class. Usually what I do when I finish with my lecture notes, I put them in order in the file, so that when it comes down to the end of the semester review, I can put them, I can do them in order that you lectured, so you can just flip through your notebooks. To be honest with you, when we cleared campus in a rather hasty manner, the lecture notes for SPC-205 and SPC-209 got dropped. I tried to put them back as best order I could. I went with sort of with the modified syllabus. I know I didn't stick to the syllabus all the way through the class. So the great thing about this being on tape is you can stop whenever you want to and flip to your notes, so you're with me at any time. Plus, I mean, hey, if you find this that enjoyable, rewatch it. It's always great. There we go. The beverage of choice today is Diet Coke. Okay, all right. That way when my voice starts to go, because I've done like 3 of these today. Okay, so we're going to start off with Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. Okay, again, what am I looking at in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 that I might draw a question from? Remember, we started off talking about human communication and public speaking. First thing we talked about is why do we even do public speaking, and we talked about the 3 general purposes of public speaking. We're going to see that again in a minute. We talked about the human communication process. Okay, we talked about the 4 required parts of the human communication process: participants, message, channel, feedback. Okay. Then we had a long conversation about multiple communications models. Those communication models are now loaded onto the documents page, so you can call them up and look at them. Okay. Then we started talking about ethics, and we talked about multiple ethical models. First of all, ends justified as a means, situational ethics, credibility-centered ethics were the 3 that we talked about. Then we talked about, again, Aristotle's means of persuasion, pathos, logos, and ethos. Please be aware of what those 3 are. Okay, all right, so that's Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. This does move fairly quickly, so feel free to hit that pause button. All right, then we went to Chapter 14. Then I've got, okay, I won't say we went to. Next will be Chapter 14. We're going to talk about delivery. First thing we talked about was the importance of the research on how delivery impacts. And here, let me highlight this. I said the first thing we needed to remember about delivery is be animated, be conversational, and act like you care. Okay? Then we talked about research on how important delivery is. The one we talked about over and over again was Bettinghouse. Okay? And the 4 combinations that Bettinghouse looked at: good speaker, good content; bad speaker, good content; good speaker, bad content; bad speaker, bad content. Be familiar with that concept. Okay? All right. Remember, we talked about how to do your note cards. Never put your entire speech on your note cards. Okay, everybody remember that? Right, we then talked about the voice. We talked about the three qualities or the characteristics of the voice: the pitch, the volume, and the rate. Okay, know what the definitions of each of those are. Okay, we talked about articulation. Articulation. Remember what articulation is. Then we talked about the vocalized pause. You may want to know what the vocalized pause is. Then we talked about physical delivery, eye contact, posture, and movement. And we said about 19 times, all movement should be motivated. All movement should be motivated. Okay? All right, and then we talked about the methods of presentation. Okay? We talked about reading from a manuscript. We talked about speaking from memory. We talked about impromptu speaking. Okay? And then we talked about the fourth one, extemporaneous speaking. The four methods of presentation: reading from a manuscript, speaking from memory, impromptu speaking, and extemporaneous speaking. Okay? Make sure you understand what each of those are. All right? So, then we talked about, then we're next going to talk about choosing your topic. All right. Remember that choosing your topic is the very first chance you get to take control of the speaking event. Okay? There are three things that you should consider in choosing your topic: the speaker, the occasion, and the audience. All right? Then you need to pick your purpose for your speech, and remember the three general purposes are, again, to entertain, to inform, and to persuade. And then we talked about how you would define a specific purpose after you get those general purposes done. And those general purposes should guide how you develop your specific purpose. Okay. Huzzah. We move along. We talked about outlining. And the main purpose of an outline is so that you can visualize your speech, so that you can test the scope and content, so that you can test the logical relation of the main points, so that you can test your supporting ideas, so that you can test the balance and the proportionality of the speech, and so that it can assist in developing your notes. And again, I issued the very clear warning: don't use your outline as an excuse to write out your speech word for word. You should never write in an extemporaneous speech. Don't ever write out your speech word for word. That's a manuscript. Okay. We talked about organizing your speech. In methods of organization. We talked about the fact that organizing your speech increases comprehension and retention of information. We talked about the orders of your main points. We talked about they can be chronological, narrative, topic order, spatial pattern, causal pattern, problem solution, and then we talked about the motivated sequence. Okay? I would be familiar with all of those. Okay? Then we talked about speaking to inform. Okay? And that its primary purpose is to convey knowledge. Key concepts would be: make sure you adjust your content for the audience. Avoid jargon, and we define jargon. Limit the information you present. Build on previous knowledge. Be memorable. Make it relevant, and be personal. Okay? Moving on to evidence. We cited 5 reasons to cite evidence: clarity, credibility, accuracy, authority, and currency. We talked about when, how, and what kind of evidence to use. And we talked about the opinions of others, statistics, and factual data. And we were discussed in great detail the differences in those. Okay? Then we talked about some guidelines on how to use evidence, like use a variety of evidence, choose appropriate forms of evidence for the audience. Okay. This is moving very quickly. This is fast. Hit pause if you need to. Go back if you need to. This is going to exist for eternity on the internet. You don't need to rush. Okay, then we talked about the problem-solution speeches. The problem-solution speeches, remember, 2 parts: cause and effect, or problem and solution. The problem has to have cause and effect. Okay, the cause of the problem is what's making it happen, and the effect is how it impacts people. The solution has to have practicality and efficacy, or viability and efficacy. Okay? Everybody should remember all of that. So solution has viability or practicality and efficacy. The problem has cause and effect. Remember what efficacy is. Remember what practicality is. Okay. We talked about the audience. We started off with Thomas P. Tip O'Neill's quote, "In all America, all politics are local." Why do we care about Tip O'Neill? Okay. We talked about demonstrating relevance to the audience through timeliness, proximity, or personal impact. That's not COVID-19. That's pollen. It's pollen. We've got pollen blowing on the wind here in Columbia County like nobody's business. My truck used to be gray. It's now a nice yellow. Okay. We talked about how to find the initial audience disposition and what that was. We talked about ways you could analyze the audience, demographic, psychographic, situational analysis, which deals with the situation of the event, purpose-oriented, and the source. And then we talked about some sources of data for audience analysis. Okay. And then we talked about audience analysis is an ongoing process. It never ends. When you finish with it, you finish with a speech, you continue to ask for feedback on how that speech went, okay? And you apply it to the next speech you're going to give this session. Okay, we talked about culture and communications. We talked about the 6 layers of culture. Be aware of those. We talked about our identity is developed from our culture, even if our identity is based on the rejection of that culture. We talked about our multiple identities, our personal, social, and cultural identities, okay? Then we talked about 3 very specific cultural identities. We talked about race, we talked about gender, and we talked about sexuality. And you would need to be aware of each of those in case I might ask a question. Okay? Then we talked about intercultural communications and the fact that cultural identity is ill-defined and self-imposed, so it can be constantly shifting. Then we talked about ethnocentrism. Okay? And then we talked about cultural appropriation. Okay? Man, we're flying through this. 12 minutes, 17 seconds, and we're rolling. Okay, then we talked about listening. Okay, remember that we discussed the difference between hearing and listening. Be aware of those differences. We discussed in great detail about the Blaine-Goss model and Blaine-Goss, who said that listening is an information processing function. Then we talked about the stages of listening: receiving, understanding, remembering, and evaluation. Then we talked about impediments to listening like noise, receiver biases, attention spans. Okay? All right? Everybody with me? All right, we're moving on. Hit pause at any time. I'm going through this incredibly fast. And I expect you to hit pause when you need to. Okay. Then we talked about language. We talked about definitions of meaning. We talked about denotative and connotative meaning. We talked about how we transition from denotative to connotative, or connotative to denotative, where we move from the contextual definition to the dictionary definition. Okay, an individual's engagement with the environment can change their interpretation of language. We talked about that. Language and thought are intertwined. Let's skip that. I don't like that. We'll get rid of that. That's not going to be on the test. I'm such a good guy. If there's a question on it, I won't write a question about that. Then we talked about the key differences between written and oral communications. Oral language has smaller variety of words. Oral language has words with fewer syllables. Oral language has shorter sentences. Oral language has more self-referential words. Oral language has fewer qualifying terms. Oral language has more pseudo-qualifying terms like many, few, some. Oral language has more extreme and superlative words, and oral language has more qualifying statements. Okay? All right? Just be aware of all of those. Okay? Then we talked about how to use language. We talked about being vivid, speak accurately. We discussed similes, metaphors, and hyperbole. Then we brought in some ideas like rhythm, parallelism, repetition, and alliteration. Be aware of all of those. Okay? Yeah, and when you're adapting your language, remember to be professional, be inclusive, and don't assume any racial or ethnic groups are all the same. Okay? All right. Persuasive speaking. This is what we covered. We're almost to the end now. I think that, in fact, this may be the end. Last chapter. Okay, persuasive speaking. Remember, we defined the difference between coercion and persuasion. Be aware of those two definitions. The first step of writing a persuasive speech is audience analysis. Because remember, that initial audience disposition is the key thing on where you want to move them from. So you have to know where they're at to move them to where you want them to be. We talked about reasoning and fallacies you can use in a persuasive speech. We talked about inductive reasoning. We talked about reasoning by analogy, reasoning by inductive reason. Okay, let me go over that again. We talked about three forms of reasoning. Inductive reasoning, which is one-to-many logic. Reasoning by analogy, which is one-to-one. And then deductive reasoning, which is the many to the one. Okay? Some fallacies that we discussed are hasty generalizations, the false analogy, false authority. Okay, we went over all of those. The argument ad hominem and the appeal to tradition. Okay, just be aware of all of those. Then we talked about some obstacles to changing attitudes, and they included selective perception, selective recall, selective exposure, the degree of commitment, and then public commitment. Okay? Then we talked about some strategies: build a case with evidence and reason, foot in the door in the face, show your proposal is consistent with existing attitudes, appeal to an alternative value premise, offer a reward, and arouse fear. Now, we were very specific in those last two that you have to use them very, very carefully. Okay? Then we talked about one-sided and two-sided persuasive speeches. And then we talked about cognitive dissonance. And then we went over, again, what the very last thing has to be in persuasive speech: your call to action. Okay. All right, so that's 17 minutes of everything you got over the last 14, 15 weeks. All right. If you remember back 35 years ago when we started this semester, I promised you that we would, get through this together. All of you have done, clearly with the Blackboard issues that have been going on the last 24 hours, I haven't watched your persuasive speeches. I am really looking forward to it. I think overall this semester people have done really incredibly well. My grades are actually a little bit higher than normal for your problem solution speeches as I compare them to other semesters. So you guys have done incredibly well up to this point. You get full compliments for that. I hope you carried it through to the end. Again, this is Thursday, the 16th of April at roughly 1:17. You got till tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock to get those speeches posted. I will be watching them over the weekend, and hopefully I'll get through all 4 sections by Monday, and I can post your grades for that by Monday. Okay? All right. This will be the last time when we get back on campus sometime in 2028. I'll be retired before then. When we get back on campus, stop by my office. Feel free to talk. Otherwise, we probably won't be. I won't be making any more tapes or lectures for you guys. I would encourage you to stay well, stay safe, take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and just try to get through this as best we can. For those of you guys that are still working, I know a couple of you guys work at the local hospitals, local care facilities. You are in my thoughts every day because, I oftentimes say that I served alongside heroes every day. You guys are my heroes. The fact that you're going into work every day. Some of you are not being paid what you deserve for the jobs you're doing in this time, and I just hope at some point in time in the future we have the ability to recognize you for what you're doing right now by continuing to keep this country moving through all of this. So, and just one last thing is, no matter what some politician tells you about how to take care of yourself, you're the one that's responsible for that, and do the best you can no matter what you hear from somebody who was elected to office. Okay? All right. Hey, God bless, Godspeed to each and every one of you. If you need me after this semester is over, you still have my email. I will be happy to reach out and talk to you guys in any instance. Eventually I will have office hours again on campus, and you can certainly stop by there and talk to me at any point in time. All right. It was great having you guys for this semester. It was a very interesting semester, and I hope, as much as I like you guys, we never, ever, ever repeat this. So stay safe and stay well.